Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there. I got caught up in some weather issues when I was traveling. And so I'm very sorry I can't be there with you live. I wanted to begin my talk today first by acknowledging the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tuvangar, on which UCLA is situated. And I want to pay my respects to the ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. I also wish to pay my respects to the Chamorro peoples of the lands of Gulhan, on which or from which I am currently speaking. I want to talk to you today about a component of a project. It's an ongoing project, so we don't have final results, called the Talent Project. Several people on the panel are also involved with this project. It has been funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. UCLA's component of this project has been focusing on delineating social and ethical considerations for archivists working with computational archival science, one component of which would be artificial intelligence. And what we have been looking at is how to promote AI implementations that are safe, reliable, transparent, and ethical across the full range of archival activities, thinking about also the implications of records that have been created that would be ingested into archives using AI, created using AI, in terms of their implications for archival work and workflow. And then also making recommendations for archival education. And as we have carried on with this research, thinking about the kinds of experimental research infrastructure that is really necessary for knowledge-based archival work using AI. So I also want to acknowledge two wonderful team members at UCLA, Nicole Wood, who is a doctoral student, and Athena Kwan, who has just graduated from our MLIS program. So by way of introduction, I would acknowledge that there are many issues, I've listed several of them here on this slide, that archivists are concerned about, but whose concerns are also shared by many other different groups and interests. And we could talk at great length about any or all of these issues, but they're all ones that we don't have to go it alone on. And what I really want to focus on today are more distinctly archival concerns, the ones that we ourselves are going to have to work through, and then thinking also about what distinctively archivists bring to these wider efforts. So the first thing to say, and it's a sort of truism, is that AI is not going away. AI is here to stay. It is already widely used. It is being used by the people who create the records that we will ingest into our archives. It's also being used by some of our researchers who are working with collections that were born digital or that have been digitized and have been datified by them or by other people. So it's already here. But we also want to think about the ways in which we could be using it ourselves to help with activities either that we already want to do, but we are very difficult to do manually, or sometimes impossible to do manually, or that are operating at such scale that very quickly or it will exceed our capacity to manage manually. So, for example, appraising, ingesting, describing massive scale records produced by systems such as those relating to digital communications. That could be bureaucratic email, it could be social media. managing complex digital preservation processes that are often quite routine, but incredibly detailed, and that have to be consistent and have to operate on an ongoing basis. Reappraising, redescribing holdings, maybe because you are reprioritizing the directions you want to take your repository, maybe for reparative description. Managing privacy, security, cultural protocols, and other complex access issues in a digital environment. Surfacing previously unknown or unrecognized evidence, information, and affect, both within your own collections and across collections that are located perhaps in multiple repositories. And I think some of the speakers on the panel will talk about that today. Curating archival collections for specific uses and specific audiences, again, often with reparative or social justice intent, and then presenting evidence and information in new ways, for example, through visualizations. So what specifically are we doing? This is a very, very sort of quick and dirty overview of the research design we're working with. We've been looking at literature that has been published across relevant fields, trying to see what their concerns are, what their suggestions are, what their approaches are, identifying relevant concerns that have been raised, and also best practices that are being proposed in other professional and technical bodies. And I've just listed a few of these here on the slide. And then mapping what we've analyzed out of this work against the case studies and experiments that have been carried out by the Talent Project, which have been put together in incredibly careful ways and trying to think about ethical and social considerations. But again, to try to see whether they've actually managed to think about all of these issues that other people have raised, and how they've addressed them, to identify any additional concerns that arise, and to think about where there might be gaps in the kinds of cases that we or others have carried out that we need to fill, in order to test whether we've really thought through social and ethical considerations sufficiently. And then finally, to build all of this into a matrix of considerations of best practices for professional use, again, continuing to test that matrix, and then building it back into archival education. That's the overview of the entire component that we're working on. And, some of the things that we've been thinking about as we go, we know that a lot of, as I've already mentioned, existing implementations tend to cluster around already archived content, and content that is already in digital form may have been datified by somebody else as well. That raises some interesting questions about, where the lines of our work begin and end versus the work that's being done by other people, for example, in data science and in the digital humanities. A second concern is that we consider all archival activities across the sort of spectrum of archival work, and think also about, instead of thinking of them as individual sort of modules of work, but to think about whether there are interdependencies in that workflow, whether more traditional workflows begin to shift, whether there are new activities that have to be integrated. For example, examining how algorithms have been trained and fine-tuned. Is that a new activity that we need to build in? Are there optimal balances that could be or should be struck between human and AI work for different kinds of activities? In what ways should source communities and communities of interest be involved in all of this work? And what kind of expertise do they bring to that we don't have? And again, what are the ethical concerns of who should be involved, and making sure that they are facilitated to be able to be involved? And then overall, how do we cope with the technological landscape constantly evolving? What are the archival through lines? Are the archival through lines conceptual? Are they to do with workflow? Is it not possible? Is everything so dynamic that we're constantly going to be changing all the time? So some of the kinds of concerns then that come up with this are, some of them are ones that we went through when we talked about electronic records early on. What, when, and how is a record, and does it really matter? Does anybody care? When do they care? How do we ensure algorithms are actually getting right what they're doing? Or probably much more accurately, how much of what are they doing are they getting right? And how much do we need to then go back and double check and maybe correct as they go? And that raises lots of interesting questions about how algorithms are trained, how they're fine-tuned, what happens to them as they operate over time. It also raises very important questions about archival contextual knowledge. Who has it? Why is it that it is so important? And that goes back to that question about what's distinctive about what we do and what we know, and how we build that into our systems. We do know that using AI, we can serve specific audiences and certain kinds of analyses better. And we can probably work really closely to make sure that those algorithms are doing what we want them to do, or that we can correct them, or we can supplement them with human knowledge in certain ways. But we also want to, we also need to reach out to more general audiences and to serve broader research uses. And so we can't always put all our eggs in one basket, and it's not clear yet whether we can use AI to optimal effect in more general cases as well as more specific cases. Another thing we're concerned about is that, with all of the ethical concern that we build into the work that we do and how we make things available and how we ensure that only the people who are supposed to use our content and use it appropriately, we have still to ensure that those records that we create aren't being used as proxy data for other people's activities that are not ethical, such as digital redlining, where they become a proxy for a kind of record they're not allowed to use in some other way, or data they're not allowed to collect. And then thinking about the tools that we supply to researchers or end users to do their own analysis, what are the ethical protections we have to build into those tools? So just 2 slides to wrap up here, that are sort of some preliminary, and I know they may seem sort of rather generic thoughts that come out of this project, and yet they're also really important and they have to be stated. First of all, that archival thinking, when we train people to think like archivists, we also have to train them to think computationally and to think with an awareness of what AI does and what it can do. Those things have to be fused in some way, so that the archivists remain, they remain the drivers of what's going on. At the same time, we don't expect archivists to be technical experts. We will bring in technical experts to do some of this work, but those technical experts also need to be trained to work in archival environments. They need to understand something about archival thinking. We need to get more precise about what that something is that they need to understand. But one of the things we do know is that conceptual rigor really is important. We said this in the era of when we were really sort of trying to find our way around dealing with digitally born records. We were looking at defining key conceptual ideas in the archival field. We have to do it again now. It is really important. Archival AI implementations must be archivally framed. And in this, what we know from our work is archival context is paramount. It has to be defined because that is still a really fuzzy statement that I just made. And then it needs to be identified and identifiable. And one of the places where that becomes really important is in ensuring that those people who are engaged in datifying collections or in training and fine-tuning algorithms need to understand what archival context is and build it in. We can't simply hand something over, for example, to a cadre of undergraduate students in computer science and say, go off and, datify this and feed it into, an algorithm and expect that it is going to do the work that we need it to do. We actually are going to have to be much more specific in saying what those elements are that need to be specifically flagged and algorithms designed to respond to. And finally, thinking about knowledge-based responsible practice. We've been saying for a very long time that the archival field needs to develop more of an evaluative, self-evaluative culture. We need to understand user needs. We need to understand user experiences. We need to understand our own workflows better and to track those over time. When you move into an AI world, we really do have to be sure that what we know, what we do, what we keep, those are all accurate, reliable, benevolent, and beneficial. And this is going to mean investing as a field in an experimental infrastructure, in designing experimental practices and methods that will help us test the things that we're going to implement. This was done by the library and information fields for decades before they got to the place where they are today. And we don't really have that in the archival field. We need to continuously monitor developments in AI record keeping, AI implementations in record keeping, the people who are sending us records that are generated out of systems that are using AI. What are the implications of that for the accuracy, the reliability of the actual records that we ingest? We need systematically to evaluate archival practices as well as end user needs, behaviors, and experiences. And we need to integrate additional expertise to identify it and integrate it that comes from both source communities and other relevant end user communities. We will never work in a world that is all automated, and we have to figure out what is the balance, or what are the balances, and how do they shift over time between manual and automated processes, and similarly between our focus on targeted implementations and more generic implementations. And the final thing I wanted to say is that we need to identify some generic approaches and practices that will help us bring the whole field along with us and not end up with a situation where we've created new forms of archival divides, where some archives, some repositories, some archivists can function in this world and do amazing things, and others are left behind. And there's apart from the issue of a divide within the field, there's another benefit to that too, that as we bring everybody along with us, the power of AI increases because we can operate not only within repositories, but increasingly we can help to operate across repositories. So I'll just leave it there because I know that we're very short on time today. Thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to respond to email questions if anybody has that about the project as well. And say again, thank you to everybody.